Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Tripp. Today I'm going to bring you a short essay where I'm applying the framework of existential logicism directly to the concept of God and the question of God and whether it's even a good question or not. Okay? If you're not familiar with existential logicism, it's a philosophical framework that attempts to boil down humanity's largest metaphysical questions into fundamental, undeniable truths that we can all agree on in hopes that we can start taking up ground and build a foundation to move forward with. And so that's what this is. This is kind of a sneak peek because this will eventually be expanded into a manuscript. So there'll be additions and revisions made to this, but I feel like the concepts and the core here is strong enough that I can go ahead and present it to the people who subscribe to this channel just as kind of a sneak peek preview of what's to come. And so that's my next philosophical project is to really expand this idea you're about to see. Nothing crazy, not the size of existential logicism. I'm going to do a series of application style books that are a third to a half the size of existential logicism. Okay. Behind me, you see some really rudimentary modeling. This is for the resolution state interface. This is the second project I'm working on. Tomorrow, what I'm hoping to bring you is a full look at the universe under the resolution state interface model, so you can really see like conceptually what it all looks like. And then I've got a lot of exciting stuff coming down the pipe as far as that's concerned. But with any luck, tomorrow I'll bring you that conceptual breakdown, and I hope you enjoy this video, and at the very least it gets you thinking. And that's it. I appreciate it.
Finite Mind, Finite God. Why Future People Won't Ask If God Exists by Matthew Zejda. Presented by Logic, an application of existential logicism to the question of God, existential ignosticism via persistent present determinism, epistemic refutation paradox, deterministic morality, illusion of nothing. In a future beyond the old God, or no God tug of war, the very question of God's existence will likely seem obsolete. This essay dissolves that false debate by showing that both religion and atheism have been grappling with a misframed problem. Stepping outside their dichotomy, we find an existential ground, a third perspective, the stance of existential ignosticism, where reality itself, not an imagined deity or a barren void, is the only necessary truth and the source of our values. From this vantage, meaning and morality arise naturally from existence, and the question, does God exist, simply loses its grip. The third category, tentatively named existential agnosticism, a God so big it's not a God at all. This is neither a theist defense nor an atheist attack. It's an attempt to step into a third class of understanding. For too long, people have felt forced to choose between two unsatisfying options: embrace a theist worldview with a personal God pulling the strings, or adopt an atheist stance denying anything beyond brute matter. Both sides share an assumption that God is a yes or no entity, an object that either exists or doesn't. What follows is a clash of absolutes. One camp clings to a divine authority, the other rejects it, and often with it any higher meaning. Yet neither camp addresses the possibility that the entire question is misframed. I write from a perspective outside this binary, an approach I'll call the existential ground. In formal terms, this third-class stance is Existential Ignosticism, EI, part of a larger framework called Existential Logicism, L. It aims to dissolve the cage we've built around the debate and show that God versus no God was a false fight all along, a bit like arguing over the shape of a shadow when we could turn to see the object casting it. In this existential ground perspective, this third class, existence itself is the bedrock. We begin with what cannot be denied. Something is happening right here, right now. Reality is manifest. One could even say experience is undeniable. Try to deny your own experience, and you're still experiencing the act of denial. That existence is the only necessary truth we know for sure. And everything else, including the idea of God, must be evaluated in relation to it. I'll argue that what people have called God is actually our finite mind's way of grasping at that bedrock. When we stop treating God as a separate supernatural person, or as a mere superstition to reject, we discover a more fundamental reality that was always present. This isn't a mystical new doctrine or an attempt to resurrect religion under another name. It's a clear-eyed look at reality as it is, beyond the stories and negations. It means respecting people while dismantling the cages of old ideas, keeping the human truths, love, wonder, moral earnestness, but shedding the literal dogmas. By the end, I hope you'll see why future generations might not even ask, does God exist? Not because everyone is cynical or godless, but because they've outgrown the frame of the question. They'll be busy asking deeper and more fruitful questions once the ghost of this false dichotomy is laid to rest. Good God, that's a bad question. Let's start with the fundamental mistake, the way we frame the question of God. The very phrasing God exists or God doesn't sets a trap. It presents a bad frame, a false dichotomy between two flawed ideas. On one hand, we imagine God as a being out there in the universe or outside it who may or may not be real. On the other hand, if we reject that, we assume no higher reality exists at all, nothing beyond physical particles and void. This framing forces a simplistic binary, God versus no God, as if these exhaust all options. But what if this is like asking, do we turn left or right, when the correct move is to step upward to a whole new level? The debate has been raging for centuries because both sides accepted the terms of the question without seeing the hidden assumption within it. The hidden assumption is that God fits into the category of existent things, something that either exists or doesn't, like a unicorn or a black hole. We treated God as a concept that could be true or false in the same way an empirical claim is true or false. A theist says yes, God exists as a supreme being, and an atheist says no, such a being does not exist. They fight over evidence, scriptures, logical arguments, but all within the frame that God is some entity whose existence is debatable. Future generations, I suspect, will chuckle at how we chased our tails on this point. They'll see that the question was a category error from the start. It's as if we were arguing about what's north of the North Pole, or debating whether existence itself exists as a particular person. In truth, the whole God versus no God setup was misleading. It led us to pit theism's infinite person against atheism's barren cosmos without realizing there was a third option, that what we were really trying to talk about with the word God was something much more fundamental, something that doesn't sit in that either, or category at all. From the vantage of existential ground, the old debate looks like two people quarreling over a mirage. One insists the mirage is a real oasis bestowed by a king, the other insists it's just empty desert. Neither realizes they're both looking at a trick of light over an actual underlying water table. The bad frame was the mirage, taking our human concept of God off in a magnified person and treating it as the only candidate for ultimate reality. The third-class perspective says, drop the mirage. Look directly at reality. The question was never God or no God, but rather what is ultimately real and how do we relate to it. When you ask that, does God exist? Starts to sound as off base as asking is existence existing or is the universe divine or not? The frame falls apart and a more productive inquiry begins. 4. The logical collapse. To really see why the God question collapses, let's walk through a simple logical proof. We start with the notion of God as unlimited, the absolute, the foundation of all that is. By definition, if something is truly God in the classical sense, it must be unlimited, infinite, the source of everything, in other words, the ultimate reality. If such a God exists, nothing could exist outside of it, because unlimited means totality. There can't be God plus something else outside God, since that would immediately make God a subset of a larger existence. So if God is truly infinite and necessary, God would encompass all that exists. This leads to a striking conclusion. God would have to be identical to existence itself, to all that is. Any other concept of God makes him less than ultimate. If you imagine a God that is a being within existence, say, a super powerful entity floating out there in space, then that God is by definition finite, limited by the context in which it exists. Such a being would not be the ultimate foundation, it would just be one more contingent thing in a larger reality. On the other hand, if you imagine a God outside of everything, that idea collapses on itself. There is no outside to all that is. Outside existence is a nonsensical phrase, like beyond everything, somewhere. You can't have something beyond everything, because everything includes, well, everything. Thus, the only way to conceive of a true God, the unlimited ground of reality, is indistinguishable from existence as a whole. And if that's what we mean by God, then asking, does God exist, is tautological. It's essentially asking, does existence exist? A question that answers itself. This is the collapse proof, in essence, carry the idea of God to its logical apex, and it collapses into the idea of total existence. The binary question evaporates because either God equals everything, in which case existence obviously exists, or you're talking about a limited God not worthy of the name, an idol of the mind. The old debate had us chasing ghosts, either defending a God who was essentially a big invisible person, or denying that big person and ending up with nothing. But logic cuts through those options by showing they were never coherent to begin with. Nothing real can be outside of reality, and nothingness itself is not actually possible in an absolute sense. Philosophers have noted that the very concept of nothing is incoherent. Even to conceive of nothing, you have to imagine, which paradoxically makes it something in your mind. In short, you can never actually have a state of absolute nothingness. Being is the default, and only state one existence is and non-existence isn't. Once we take that on board, we see how the idea of a God separate from existence had smuggled in an impossible scenario all along, as if existence could step aside and make room for a second, separate thing called God. No such outside room exists. The upshot is profound. The only God that could exist would be all of existence, leaving no meaningful verses at all. Unlimited God reduces to totality. Otherwise, it's limited and not God. Future thinkers will likely view our God debates with a bit of humor and compassion. They'll say people argued for ages about whether everything came from a creator or from nothing, not realizing that nothing was never on the table, and that an infinite creator can't be anything but everything. It's a classic case of a bad question. The moment you see that existence has no outside, the question is there a God separate from existence becomes meaningless. In logical terms, unlimited and totality. An unlimited being is just another way of talking about totality itself. Conversely, a limited God, one being among others, isn't truly God at all, just a big creature. Thus, either God is the entirety of being, in which case saying God exists adds nothing beyond existence exists, or what you're calling God is a finite idol, and you're left with the rest of existence anyway. In both cases, the God versus no God dichotomy collapses. There is no third option, where an infinite God stands apart from an also existing universe. We've debunked the frame no outside to all that is, no throne for a separate deity, and no abyss of nothingness either. Reality is here, and it has no opposite. Seen this way, the whole question of God's existence doesn't spark endless debate anymore. It dissolves in the face of what's self-evident. This kind of decisive logical cutoff is a bit like a contingency guillotine, slicing away any supposed outside context or magical nothingness. The idea of anything outside of totality loses its head, so to speak, under the blade of reason. Finite mind, finite God. If the only coherent God is essentially all of existence, why did humanity spend millennia worshipping various partial images of God? The answer lies in the finite mind. We humans are limited creatures trying to grasp an unlimited reality. So we create finite gods, personified images, symbols, and stories that capture aspects of the infinite in a form our minds can handle. Every religion took a stab at depicting the ultimate truth, but inevitably those depictions reflect the people who made them. A tribe that prizes law and order imagines a law-giving God handing down commandments. A culture steeped in love and forgiveness imagines a compassionate God caring for every soul. A community of warriors might imagine a mighty protector God. Philosophers might strip God of human personality and describe a pure being or logos. Each of these concepts highlights something: morality, love, power, reason. But none of them is the infinite whole. They can't be, by definition. A finite mind's picture cannot encompass infinite reality. So we end up with gods that look suspiciously like their creators. They favor the same virtues our culture favors, condemn the same enemies our society dislikes, and even endorse the social structures that prevailed when the scriptures were written. This doesn't mean those images are pure fantasy or useless. Often they encode moral insights or existential intuitions, but it does mean they are local translations of the ultimate, not the ultimate itself. Religions are translations. Existence is the thing being translated. Religions, then, can be thought of as translation layers on reality. They take the raw mystery of existence and package it into narratives and rules that people can live by. But over time, the package is mistaken for the reality. People start to worship the finite image instead of the infinite truth it was hinting at. The metaphors solidify into dogmas. What was once perhaps a poetic way to relate to existence, God is our Father, meaning existence cares for us like a parent, gets literalized. God literally is a Father in heaven, and you must obey or be punished. The finite minds put bars around the infinite and create conceptual cages. And institutions, churches, mosques, temples, often then have a stake in keeping that cage intact. It becomes their source of authority and control. Questioning the image or stepping outside the cage threatens the whole enterprise, so doubt or innovation is discouraged. Over centuries, you get an accumulation of doctrines and decrees, many noble, some dubious, all presented as the truth. But in reality, they are finite placeholders for a truth too big for any one system. Recognizing this is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it means no single religion has a monopoly on truth, each is a finite attempt. Liberating because it means we can appreciate the insights of religions without being confined by their literal claims. For future humans, this realization will be commonplace. They will see personal gods and specific dogmas as childhood drawings of reality, earnest and meaningful to us at one stage, but not mistaken for photographs. The finite gods served a role. They were how a finite mind related to infinite existence in story form. But as our understanding grows, we don't need to discard everything those stories gave us. We just need to stop taking the stories for the thing itself. As Alfred Korzybski observed, the map is not the territory, and the portrait is not the person. God concepts are maps and portraits, sketched by finite minds. The territory is existence. The great error was confusing the two, and fighting holy wars over maps while the real landscape lay open to everyone. In the future, we won't need to personify thunder as Thor or Zeus. We have meteorology. Likewise, we won't need to personify the origin and order of the universe as Yahweh or Brahma. We have ontology and cosmology, along with the sense of wonder at existence itself. Finite minds created finite gods, but infinite existence quietly continued, waiting for us to notice it directly. The limitations of preferences. There's another clue that all our traditional gods were finite stand-ins. They have preferences. In religious stories, God or the gods takes sides, issues commandments, loves some things, and hates others, favoring one tribe or one virtue over another. But an unlimited being wouldn't have local finite preferences. Any such preference implies limitation. Think about it. If God is truly all-encompassing, there is nothing outside God to favor or reject. Any preference for how humans behave, or any need for worship or glory, would suggest that God lacks something or could be displeased by something not aligning with his desire. That very notion contradicts the idea of a complete, infinite reality. An infinite being, by definition, couldn't be dependent on anything, and having preferences, desires, goals, pet peeves, is a characteristic of limited beings who are incomplete, or who exist in a larger context of alternatives. In simpler terms, if your concept of God includes he wants X and not Y, you're already talking about a limited entity. A perfect, unlimited entity encompassing totality wouldn't want in the human sense. It wouldn't be picking and choosing between possibilities or favoring one outcome over another. Wanting X over Y means there's some potential reality in which X and Y are distinct and one is better, but if God is all. 8. Reality, then X and Y are just parts of that reality. Would an unlimited God prefer one part of itself to another? Would totality have a vendetta against some subset of itself? The idea is absurd. Yet religious narratives often portray exactly that, a God with a personality, likes and dislikes, even moods and plans. Those traits are telltale signs of anthropomorphism. We have projected our own limited mind's experience, which includes having preferences, making choices, feeling needs, onto the infinite. If a depiction of God shows bias, anger, jealousy, or changing plans, it is by definition not describing an immutable infinite reality, but a finite mental image. In short, preference implies limitation, and an infinite God cannot be limited. Realizing this helps us further step out of the cage. Many fear that without a God who issues preferences and rules, do this, not that, morality and meaning would collapse. But as we'll see, that isn't so. Moral truths don't evaporate when we remove the idea of a cosmic rule enforcer. They simply get relocated to where they always implicitly were, in the fabric of reality and the experience of conscious beings, not in the dictates of an outside personality. For now, the key point is that a God concept loaded with personal preferences was another mirage of the finite mind. An unlimited ground of being would have no external enemies, no needs from us, no arbitrary rules that benefit one era or group. It would simply be, and everything that is would flow from it. So whenever people argued, God really wants you to eat or not eat this food, wear these clothes, say these prayers, they were in effect reducing the infinite to a cultural checklist. That served social cohesion perhaps, but it wasn't the ultimate truth. Future generations will shake their heads at the idea that the creator of the universe had a favorite blood sacrifice, or a preferred day of the week. They'll see that as further evidence that those gods were finite figurines carved by human minds, not the boundless reality that actually underlies everything. The Primacy Test. One way to tell if someone is ready to move beyond the cage of a finite God is what I call the Primacy Test. It's a simple, almost personal question when your deepest sense of truth, your heart, conflicts with a religious rule or text the book. Which do you consider primary? In other words, if your scripture or tradition told you to do something that you clearly saw as cruel or absurd, would you obey it because God said so, or would you trust your own moral insight that it's wrong? This scenario isn't just hypothetical, it happens all the time in subtle ways. Holy books contain passages that condone violence, inequality, or other troubling things. Modern believers often reinterpret or ignore those passages, guided by a higher empathy or reason that says, that can't be right. When they do this, they are choosing heart over book, essentially admitting that there is a moral insight or truth in them that outranks a line in Scripture. That act is hugely significant. It means, whether they realize it or not, they have placed reality and conscience above dictated authority. They have implicitly said, if my understanding of compassion conflicts with an ancient command, compassion wins. That is the primacy test in action. Why is this important? Because it reveals that even devout people, at their core, often trust existential truth over external authority. A loving Christian doesn't actually stone their disobedient child, even if the Old Testament might prescribe. Their own heart recoils, and they listen to that. A faithful Muslim troubled by violent interpretations of jihad might conclude that Allah is most truly known through mercy, and thus reject an imam's call to brutality, trusting their inner sense of the divine. In each case, the ground of value is shifting from the book to the heart, from an inherited rule to a living insight. The consequences of admitting this primacy are enormous. It means acknowledging that moral truth isn't true because a holy book says so. Rather, the book, when it is true because it aligns with deeper reality. The real authority is not the text, but whatever the text was trying imperfectly to point to, typically human compassion, fairness, the well-being of conscious creatures, our lived understanding of love and harm. If a person acknowledges that, they've taken the first step out of the cage. They're effectively saying, if my religion told me to betray my own conscience, I'd suspect something's wrong with the religion. That's the third-class perspective knocking on the door of their mind. The decisive question of the primacy test, heart or book, shows where one's true north lies. And if the answer is heart, then you are already living as if existence, with your human conscience as part of it, is the higher lawgiver. You've said that reality as you directly apprehend it, through empathy, reason, experience, has more weight than a mediated story about reality. This doesn't mean you must throw away your faith or community. It means you recognize that the source of truth within it was never the parchment or the pulpit, but the resonance it had was something real in you and in the world. Taking that seriously leads naturally to the next step, examining the whole stack of religious authority with eyes wide open. And that is where the cracks in the cage become impossible to ignore. If the book fell tomorrow, the reality you meet in your chest would remain. That tells you which is primary, belief in gods or books. When you turn a clear light on the edifice of organized religion, a series of exposures occur. It's like lifting a large rock. Suddenly you see what was squirming underneath, all the hidden assumptions and human elements that were taken on faith. I often enumerate a 6-count set of critical observations that, once grasped, can permanently alter one's view of religious systems. Profound disagreement first. We notice the sheer diversity of religions and their mutual contradictions. They can't all be the one absolute truth, because they flatly disagree on fundamentals. The nature of God or gods, the path to salvation, what's morally required, what happens after death. If one were literally true in all its claims, the others would have to be false. And yet billions of people have lived good, sincere lives in each of these traditions. This suggests that religions are culture-bound interpretations of something, rather than direct lines to a singular cosmic truth. It exposes that what people often call absolute truth is heavily relative to where and when they were born. A child born in Saudi Arabia is very likely to grow up Muslim, in Thailand likely Buddhist, in Italy likely Catholic. The faiths map to geography and history, which is a red flag if one of them is supposed to be the unique, transcendent truth. It looks instead like different human tribes telling different stories about ultimate reality. Canon contingency, delve into how Holy Scriptures actually came to be, and you find a mess of human decisions and accidents. Which Gospels made it into the New Testament? A council of bishops voted on them centuries after Jesus, and many other Gospels were left out as apocrypha. Which sayings of Muhammad were recorded and deemed authentic hadith? A painstaking process of collection and vetting by scholars, rife with politics and subjectivity. The Hindu Vedas and Buddhist sutras were orally transmitted for ages, undoubtedly changing along the way. In short, the canons are contingent, assembled by people in specific contexts. Entire books or teachings could have been lost, or others included, and today's Word of God would be different. This exposure undermines the idea that Scriptures dropped whole from heaven or are eternally perfect. We see the human fingerprints all over these supposedly divine texts. That doesn't automatically nullify all their value, but it means we can't reasonably treat any one compilation of writings as the infallible and exclusive communication from the absolute. They are historical records of belief, not bulletproof transcripts from God's mouth. Moral outsourcing. Religions often encourage people to outsource their moral reasoning. Complex questions of right and wrong get reduced to what does the holy book or the priest imam guru say. That can be comforting. You feel you have an answer key for life, but it comes at a cost. It can stunt moral development and allow harmful norms to persist just because they're traditional. Consider how many people defended slavery, the oppression of women, or persecution of minorities by citing scripture and religious authority. When we outsource morality, we stop looking directly at real consequences in human suffering, and instead obey abstract rules. This exposure is seeing that many believers, despite good intentions, have let their conscience take a backseat to dogma. It's not that religious people have no conscience, often they have a very strong one, but they've been taught that trusting it over the letter of doctrine is sinful or prideful. So they force themselves to fit their moral intuition into the scriptural box, or they live with guilt and cognitive dissonance when it doesn't fit. Realizing this is liberating, you see that no moral rule is better than the people interpreting it. If a rule doesn't make sense to a compassionate, informed heart, maybe the rule is what's wrong, not you. A mature ethics can't be about outsourcing. It has to be owned. Retrofitting and cherry-picking, religions continually adapt. After the fact, they retrofit their teachings to align with societal progress, often while denying that they're doing so. Take how many religious groups now condemn slavery, endorse religious tolerance, or accept scientific findings like evolution or a heliocentric solar system. You can find verses in holy books that say the opposite of those modern positions. What happened? Believers reinterpreted those verses, or decided they were metaphorical or applicable only to a certain time. In other words, the religion adjusted to external reality and moral progress, not the other way around. This exposure shows that morality and truth aren't truly emanating from the religious doctrine, they're passing through it from the outside. People find ways to make their eternal scripture suddenly congruent with modern humanitarian values, which implies those values came from somewhere else. Humanistic reasoning, empathy, evidence, and the scripture had to be bent to fit. Once you see that, it's hard to maintain that religion has an exclusive grip on truth. Clearly humans are figuring things out using reason and compassion, then updating what they claim their God really meant. The heavy lifting is done by human progress. Religion often just plays catch-up and then retroactively takes credit for moral truths it initially resisted. Control incentives, organized religions, especially once established as institutions, develop strong incentives to preserve their own influence. This point can sound cynical, but history provides plenty of evidence. If questioning or new ideas threaten the authority of the church or clergy, they often react with repression. Think of Galileo and the Inquisition, or reformers labeled as heretics. There's a structural reason if your institution claims to be the guardian of ultimate truth and the gatekeeper of salvation. Any crack in that claim is an existential threat to its power. So there's a built-in motive to discourage critical thinking and encourage group conformity. Fear is a common tool. The faithful might be warned that doubt is from the devil, or that leaving the fold means eternal damnation, or that questioning the holy book is pride that God will punish. These tactics can keep generations in line, but when exposed, they look less like cosmic truths and more like social control mechanisms. None of this is to say every religious leader is cynical or evil. Many sincerely believe they are protecting souls. But the net effect over time is that religions create cages of belonging. You stay in the belief system partly because you're afraid not to. Once someone sees that dynamic, the spell is broken. A truth that needs threats to sustain it starts to smell of human power, not divine mandate. The silence of new revelation. Finally, consider that in most major faiths, the age of revelation is long past. We're told that God spoke to prophets or incarnated in certain eras thousands of years ago, but since then, silence. Why would ultimate truth be doled out in pre-modern times, and then essentially stop updating just as humans develop science, democracy, and global communications? The fact that all holy texts are ancient and often ambiguous means believers today must rely on interpretation of archaic contexts to address radically new problems. This exposure suggests it wasn't a deliberate divine plan to reveal everything in ancient dialects to unadvanced societies. More likely, those were simply the times when certain ideas emerged from human cultures. It casts doubt on the premise that these specific old texts contain the final and perfect answers for all time. In any other field, if someone said no new information or clarification will ever appear, we'd find that suspect. The God's sudden quietude for millennia looks more like the natural plateau of human myth-making rather than the voice of a living universe. If the universe, or ground of being, truly speaks, maybe it does so continually through experience, discovery, and insight, not by having stopped with one book ages ago. Each of these 6 points, the disagreement, the contingent canon, the moral outsourcing, the retrofitting, the control incentives, and the closed revelation, exposes religion as a human construct layered over reality. This doesn't mean the yearnings and values behind religion are invalid. On the contrary, those yearnings for meaning, for connection, for moral order are very real. But it means the forms they took were provisional. To use a gentle metaphor, religion was our training wheels for understanding existence. It kept us balanced for a while, sometimes at the cost of some freedom of movement. Now, the training wheels are wobbling and holding us back. Expose the apparatus for what it is, and you're left with either a fall into nihilism, or if you see clearly the realization that the ground was always there under our feet. We can ride on, under our own balance, into the next stage. Gap of the gods. Can atheists feel things? For many, the first reaction to seeing through religion's layers is to swing hard to the other side, atheism. If the gods were human-made, then perhaps there's nothing beyond the material world. Many of us have either experienced or witnessed the zeal of the newly deconverted, throwing out not just God but anything that smacks of transcendence or sacredness, determined not to be fooled again. There's a certain freedom in that, a clearing of the slate. The old idol is toppled, and the mind feels cleansed of superstition. But after the celebration, something becomes apparent, a big gap where a framework used to be. Religion, for all its errors, provided a cosmic narrative and a moral anchor. Now, in pure atheism, especially the kind that's defined mainly by what it's against, one can find oneself in a vacuum. The world is suddenly nothing but matter and randomness. Purpose, meaning, morality, are these just human inventions with no binding power? The vacuum can lead to nihilism or a sense of drift. Many atheists avoid that pit only by smuggling in values from the very traditions they left, often without admitting it. I call this phenomenon smuggled odds. A passionate atheist might declare, there is no divine law, no ultimate meaning, and yet in the next breath insist on the importance of human rights, equality, justice, or care for the planet. They might ridicule religious morals as arbitrary, then fervently advocate, say, for the inherent dignity of persons or the urgent duty to combat climate change. Don't misunderstand, I agree with them on those causes, but from a strictly atheistic, materialist standpoint, where do those oughts come from? If the universe truly is just electrons in empty space, one can't derive an ought from that alone. Often, these secular humanists are carrying over moral intuitions that historically grew in religious soil. The idea of human dignity, for example, has roots in the religious notion of souls or imago Dei, being made in God's image. They've thrown out the theology but kept the value, which is fine, except if they claim their values are purely self-evident or scientific. In truth, these are ethical axioms that need a grounding story. Atheism as a negation doesn't provide one, it just negates the old. Some atheists try to patch the gap with science or rational philosophy. They say, we don't need God. Evolution and society explain morality because cooperation helped us survive, or we can reason our way to moral principles by understanding consequences. These explanations are partially true and certainly useful, but they often quietly rely on an unspoken premise, for example, that well-being is good or that life has value. Those aren't empirically proven facts, they are value-laden assumptions ones most of us share but still assumptions, without acknowledging something fundamental, like why one ought to prefer flourishing over suffering beyond personal preference. The atheist worldview can seem to steal the crown jewels, compassion, purpose, wonder from religion, while denying the treasury they came from. It's a bit like blasting the foundations of a building, and then, as the floor wobbles, propping it up hastily with whatever you can find. Performatively, many atheists live as though certain things are sacred: human life, truth, love, even as they theoretically deny that anything is sacred. This contradiction isn't because they are foolish or hypocritical, it's because the human need for meaning and value doesn't disappear with God, and something will fill that gap. New atheism, which rose in the early 21st century, was great at critique. It exposed a lot of the absurdities of fundamentalism and dogma, basically much of the exposure set we just discussed, but it largely failed to offer a positive, cohesive alternative. Science will give us the answers is not, by itself, emotionally or morally sustaining. Science gives us knowledge, not purpose. Be good for goodness' sake is a nice slogan. But what is goodness grounded in? For some, personal or humanistic love is enough of a grounding. I love my family, I care about others, that's why I do good. That's beautiful, but notice it's essentially an appeal to an experiential truth. Love, empathy, which ironically is close to an existential ground notion, We do good because we feel the reality of others' suffering is something that matters. The atheist often can't explain why it matters except to say because we choose to make it matter. And so we go in circles, a voluntary, perhaps somewhat fragile agreement that will behave as if life is meaningful even though ultimately we might think it isn't objectively so. This is the new front problem of atheism. It doesn't guide people out of the wreckage into a new dwelling, it just demolishes the old house. Many former believers find themselves stuck in a kind of limbo, longing for the structure or comfort they gave up, unsure how to rebuild a worldview that satisfies the heart as well as the mind. To be fair, not all atheists are in this quandary. Plenty have constructed rich, ethical, meaningful lives by drawing on philosophy, art, community, and personal passion. But I'd argue they often do so by tapping into the existential realities that they may not explicitly name. They invoke human solidarity, the awe of existence, the felt imperative to alleviate suffering. Values and intuitions are not dictated by atheism. They emerge from the very ground of being that religion had tried to personify. A fully negative atheism, defined just by rejection, offers no route to these treasures. People end up rediscovering them through lived experience itself. Thus, atheism cleared the idol from the altar, but it left the altar empty with a sign that said, "Figure it out yourself." The gap is real, and if it's not addressed, it can lead either to a return of dogma. Nature abhors a vacuum, and humans abhor an existential vacuum, or to a persistent sense of loss. The third-class perspective seeks to fill this gap not with a new dogma, but by pointing directly to the ground that was there all along, the reality which both theists and atheists were indirectly circling. So now what? So what is the replacement for the old paradigm? It's actually disarmingly simple. Start with reality itself, the ground of existence, and build up from there, letting go of unsupported assumptions. This means acknowledging a few key things. First, existence is our unquestionable starting point. As noted, something is happening right here, right? And believe, Tony don't werak. On stand we doubt. Beyond that's now supernatural being to have a foundation, reality is the foundation. Second, we recognize that we as conscious beings are part of this reality, and so our experiences of meaning, value, joy, suffering, these are also undeniably real in that they occur. They may be emergent properties of brains or what have you, but the point is, experience matters because it is literally the only way anything matters. Without someone to experience something, the concept of mattering doesn't even make sense. From these recognitions, we derive a very down-to-earth guiding principle. Ethics and meaning are about the consequences of actions on conscious beings within reality. There's no need to appeal to heaven or hell, divine commands, or cosmic teleology. We have cause and effect, and we have awareness. These together can ground an ought in the fabric of what is. This is essentially consequence realism CR, grounding our moral oughts in real outcomes rather than divine edicts. What does that look like practically? It means realizing that if I do something that causes harm, and I know it causes harm, that knowledge will create a kind of internal feedback. Call it conscience, call it psychological tension. It's a real phenomenon. When my awareness outpaces my old habits, and I see that, say, an action of mine causes suffering to others, or even to myself in the long run, continuing that action will create an inner conflict. It's like trying to keep touching a hot stove. After you've learned it's hot, you will feel a strong urge not to. If you override that urge, you'll experience pain. In moral terms, when we know better, but don't do better, we suffer inside. There's no need to invoke a divine punishment. The punishment and also the guidance is built into our very being. We could phrase it this way: reality punishes us with internal discord when we act against truths we have seen, and conversely, reality rewards us with a sense of integrity, relief, even joy when we align our actions with our understanding. This isn't mystical, it's largely psychological and social, but that makes it no less real. It's as real as gravity. Ignore it and you hit the ground. By rooting our values in this awareness, alignment, harmony dynamic, we get a morality that doesn't require any external lawgiver, yet binds all sufficiently aware beings. If you are capable of understanding the impact of your actions, you will invariably face this force, cause harm knowingly, and you'll feel the fracture, do the right thing as you understand it, and you'll feel the wholeness. We might call this a deterministic moral force, DMF, in that it's a natural consequence of being a conscious social organism in a lawful universe. Your ought arises from the is of your situation. Because you are aware of another's pain, you ought not cause it, not because a guru or God decreed it, but because to do so would create a fracture in your own being and in the social fabric you depend on 2-3. If that sounds abstract, think of a concrete example. Suppose I become aware that the cheap clothes I buy are made in sweatshops where workers suffer. The moment I truly grasp that, I'll feel a moral tension if I continue shopping the same way. It's not that a commandment from on high suddenly came down. It's that reality revealed a truth to me: people are suffering, and I'm contributing. And now if I ignore it, I carry that dissonance. My mind and heart will nudge me, this is not right. That nudge is the new voice of ought. It was in us all along, often attributed to God or dismissed as subjective, but it's a deterministic outcome of how consciousness works. Aligning with it, maybe by buying more ethically or helping those workers in some way, resolves the tension. The relief and sense of rightness that follow aren't divine approval. They're what it feels like to live in accordance with truth. The ought comes from what happens to you when you ignore what you now know. In this replacement worldview, awareness is the new authority. The more we see and understand reality, especially the realities of other conscious beings, the more our ethics naturally refine themselves. You don't need fear of hell or the lure of heaven to be moral. You just need a clear appreciation of cause and effect and a capacity for empathy. A person who truly internalizes that hurting others will also hurt themselves through the internal fracture it creates, will avoid doing harm not out of pious obedience, but out of enlightened self-interest and compassion. And if someone does not have that awareness, say a sociopath, no amount of holy text is likely to fix them anyway. Conversely, if someone does have that awareness, they don't need a holy text to tell them what they already feel. Notice that this approach doesn't lead to chaotic moral relativism. If anything, it explains why so many core moral principles are near universal. Don't murder, don't cheat, help those in need. Those principles emerged across cultures because they are obvious strategies for beings like us to live together successfully. Whenever we violate them, things go badly, and we feel the strain. We used to package these truths as commandments from God. God orders you not to kill, so don't. But now we can see them as natural laws of conscious life. If you murder, you unleash suffering and fear, and as a member of a social species with empathy, that will tear you apart too. It's not wrong in the sky. It's wrong in the very practical sense of what it does to reality, to others, and to yourself for. Crucially, this replacement isn't just a moral system. It's a shift in how we find meaning. By dropping the preoccupation with an external God or an external void, we start to engage directly with existence. Life is no longer about scoring points for heaven or proving God doesn't exist. It's about participating fully in reality. We begin to see every moment, every relationship, every discovery as part of the unfolding of existence, inherently precious without needing a cosmic stamp of approval. This perspective can imbue life with a new kind of sacredness, not a supernatural sanctity, but a profound appreciation for what is. The awe once reserved for God we now feel toward the cosmos and consciousness itself. The sense of duty once tied to divine commands we now find in our responsibility to each other and ourselves, to live truthfully and kindly. It's a cleaner, and in many ways more demanding ethos. We can't offload our responsibilities to a higher power or hide behind divine will. We are the ones who must understand and choose. But far from rendering life empty, this makes life feel more authentic and immediate. We trade the borrowed light of belief for the felt sunlight of reality, and discover it's warm and illuminating in ways dogma never was. One might wonder, is anything lost in this transition? The comfort of believing a personal God loves you, the communal rituals, the idea of cosmic justice, those can be hard to let go. But something is gained that ultimately outweighs the loss, a sense of integrity and freedom. Nothing is taken on faith. You are free to question everything, and your beliefs actually mean something because they're tied to evidence and experience, not just tradition. You also gain a sense of unity with those you might have once seen as other, if no one has divine favor or damnation hanging over them. Then all humans, indeed all conscious beings, meet on the level ground of existence, and we judge ideas and actions by their results, not by their labels or origins. In the long run, this replacement of the old frame with the existential ground is not a loss of religion, it's a maturation of it. It's like realizing the God we were seeking was here all along, in the truth of being. When you live in honest relationship with that, life doesn't become drab. If anything, every moment glows a bit more because you know this is it. This is reality in all its wonder and challenge, and you are participating in it directly. That, I propose, is far more fulfilling than any scripted role in a cosmic play where the ending was decided for you. The time is now brief aside on time, for those interested. One lingering question from the old God debate is, did the universe begin, and if so, what was before it? Many religious narratives posit a moment of creation, God snapping his fingers and time itself starting. Atheists might counter with a big bang arising from nothing, or an eternal oscillating universe. The existential ground perspective suggests a subtle reframing. Time itself is part of existence, not a container outside it. Modern physics hints that asking what happened before time began is as misguided as our earlier question about what's north of the North Pole. Time began with the universe, so there was no before in a temporal sense. In fact, relativity shows that time is woven into space and matter. It's not an independent backdrop at all. Why mention this here? Because it dissolves another false image, the idea of a lone God sitting for eons in a void, then deciding one day to create something. Instead, whatever the ground of being is, it isn't sitting in time at all, it's ever present. This perspective aligns with what I call persistent present determinism, PPD, the view that only the present moment truly exists, and that it unfolds deterministically. Some thinkers talk about a persistent present, the notion that only the present moment truly exists, and it's continuously renewed. In theological language, one could say creation is continuous. Existence is ongoing, not a one-and-done event in the distant past. In plain terms, reality is always happening now, and whatever caused reality is within this now, not an agent that acted once back then. This perspective cuts off the temptation to ask, but what about before existence? There is no before. Existence didn't start in time, time starts within existence. Thus, we need not invoke a beginning from absolute nothing, an incoherent idea, as discussed, nor fret about infinite regress. The ground simply is, and time flows within it like a current in the ocean of being. This understanding aligns well with both modern cosmology and certain mystical intuitions, and it further underlines how nothingness was never an option, not temporally, not logically. Existence doesn't need a birthday, it's the context in which birthdays and everything else happen, off-ramps, We've covered a lot of ground, from dismantling an age-old debate to sketching a new foundation. But grand ideas mean little if they don't help real people find their way forward. In practical terms, how might someone step off the old roads of theism or atheism and walk this new path of existential ground? Think of these as two off-ramps from a circular highway, each leading to the same open landscape. In the language of our Existential Logicism L framework, you could say these off-ramps serve as a way to resolve the inner tension you feel. They help a person transition from a closed-loop worldview into a resolved, open understanding of reality. For the believer, you might be someone who has held God dear, who finds comfort, purpose, or community in faith. The thought of no God might feel like a loss of meaning or moral compass. The message here is not that you must become a cold materialist, far from it. It's an invitation to realize that the good, true, and beautiful things you loved about God were never truly outside of reality. The love you felt shining down was real, but it exists in your relationships, in the marvel of life, in the warmth and conscience within your own chest. If existence is God, then we are the mind of that existence. The moral guidance you cherish doesn't evaporate. It lives in your heart, in empathy, and in the lessons humanity has learned over time. You don't have to throw away the fruits of your faith, the compassion, the awe, the quest for justice. You only shed the cage of literalism and authority that claimed exclusive rights to those fruits. Keep your heart, ditch the cage. You may still pray or meditate if it centers you, but perhaps you'll find the listener on the other end is not an old man in the sky, but reality itself, with your own deepest self reflecting back wisdom. You can continue to celebrate rituals and holidays, but now as a conscious choice to honor heritage or community, not out of fear or blind obligation. In essence, nothing good needs to die when God as an idea fades. What's good in it was always the human and cosmic truth beneath the label. As a gentle experiment, try living one day as if there is no divine safety net, only your own conscience and the support of your fellow humans. You may find it sobering, but also oddly empowering and authentic. The off-ramp for believers is not a plunge into meaninglessness. It's a turn toward a more direct, unfiltered relationship with the same reality you once ascribed to God. It's carrying forward all the love and hope and wonder, but now attributing them to where they've been, all along, our shared existence. For the atheist, you might be someone who has long rejected God and religion, perhaps proudly so. You value evidence and logical consistency, and you bristle at anything that smells like spiritual platitudes. The idea of existential ground might strike you as just, rebranding God as nature, or sneaking metaphysics in the back door. But consider this perspective not as a concession to mysticism, but as an expansion of humanism. You already cherish reality. Likely you marvel at the cosmos through science, or find meaning in human creativity and love. The real shift here is to stop defining your stance in opposition to theism. That fight is over, logically speaking, and start articulating what you affirm. The existential ground stance says, I affirm existence, I affirm truth, I affirm compassion and meaning as real phenomena that arise in this universe. None of that requires belief in the supernatural. In fact, it thrives without it. You lose nothing of your rational rigor. You're simply enriching the narrative that goes with it. Rather than saying, there is no God, period, you might say, there is no need for a separate personal God, because existence itself, with all its laws and patterns, is enough and is always here. It's a way of being spiritual without any spirits, using spiritual only in the sense of deeply valuing and feeling connected to life. Atheism can sometimes carry performative skepticism that verges on cynicism, an automatic nullifying of anything that can't be measured. The off-ramp here is to allow yourself to feel the awe and moral urgency that reality warrants. You don't have to call anything sacred if that word bugs you, but you can certainly recognize worth. The earth is worth protecting with or without a holy scripture to say so. Love is worth nurturing. Consciousness is worth exploring. None of these are illusions. Just because they're emergent properties of matter, they are as real as it gets for us. So for the atheist, the step is to embrace a positive identity rooted in existence, not just a negative identity against religion. In doing so, you might discover unexpected common ground with thoughtful believers. You both care about living ethically and finding meaning. Only you draw from different narratives. In the existential ground view, those narratives merge into one big story, reality unfolding and becoming aware of itself through us. Both off-ramps converge on the same highway of life beyond the old question. And on that road, a simple guiding principle reigns, judged by results, not labels. If embracing this existential perspective makes someone kinder, wiser, more at peace, then it is a good fruit. If clinging to a belief, any belief, theistic or atheistic, makes one bitter, closed-minded, or cruel, that is a bad fruit, however orthodox or intellectually rigorous it might seem. We move forward by testing these things in lived experience, essentially an experiential method. Try living as if existence is enough, and see how it impacts you and those around you. Try grounding your moral choices in real consequences and empathy, rather than in dogma or pure relativism, and see if you feel more whole. This isn't a conversion campaign, it's an invitation to experiment with truth in your own life. The future won't ask what religion or philosophy you nominally endorsed. It will see the world we've created through our actions. So let's make those actions count. Let's meet each other not as theist or atheist, believer or skeptic, but as fellow parts of the same reality, figuring it out together. In that spirit, leave the old debate on the roadside. What matters now is what we do with the clarity we have. Judge by results, not labels. Keep what makes you truer and kinder, discard obedience to fiction. And this, ultimately, is why future people won't be asking if God exists, not because they've discarded meaning, but because they've found, grounded in reality itself, beyond the shadow of that old question. Conceptual grounding. Existential Ignosticism, EI, the stance that the traditional does God exist. Question is misframed. Instead of choosing theism or atheism, it affirms that existence itself is the fundamental reality. The third-class perspective beyond the God or no God dichotomy. Persistent present determinism, PPD, the view of time and causality holding that only the present moment truly exists a persistent present, and that each moment unfolds deterministically from prior conditions. There is no external timeline or before outside of existence. Reality is an ongoing, law-governed now. Existential Logicism, L, the broader philosophical framework that encompasses these concepts. It emphasizes using lived experience and rigorous logic to understand reality, the existential ground. L provides a structured way to integrate insights like EI, PPD, and the moral determinism and the dynamics of consequence and awareness into a coherent worldview. Consequence realism, CR, the ethical principle that grounds morality in real-world consequences for conscious beings, rather than invoking divine commands or pure relativism. CR holds that what is morally good or bad depends on the actual impacts, the results of actions on ourselves and others in reality. Deterministic moral force, DMF, the inherent feedback mechanism by which awareness of truth binds us to moral outcomes. In DMF, once you know an action causes harm, continuing to do it will inevitably produce internal conflict, a fracture, whereas doing what you recognize as right brings internal harmony, a sense of wholeness. It's the natural force linking awareness to moral consequence.